Yoganath. You tell me just how I can take this yoga serious when all it ever gives to me is a pain in my posteriors.
Yoga means different things to different people. For example, there is Raja Yoga, there is Hatha Yoga, there's a whole bunch of other different kinds of yogas. What we are concerned here is about what I would call modern postural yoga, as we typically understand when people say, I'm going to a yoga class. That's what they actually mean. Start with the basics of Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga literally means discipline of force, and we will see in a few slides later what that discipline of force really means. So we have a clear history of yoga from the time of Goraknath. One of the postures bears his name, and he probably around the 12th century postulated a whole series of them, and he's been revered all across India, and not just in India, in Nepal as well. So for example, Gurkhas derive their name from him. So Hatha Yoga is a discipline of force. Remember what we always think about Gurkhas about? They're all about force. The actual tradition of yoga that most people follow today, the Hatha Yoga, is what was known as the Nath tradition. And what was very curious about Nath tradition is that it cut across all castes and all religions. So it was not the strict domain of a particular caste in India, nor was it the domain of one particular religion. As a result, it gained a huge amount of popularity. So it is a 1,000-year-old tradition. Generally, if you look at the legend, they talk about 84,000 different postures or asanas. But if you go back and look at Patanjali's original Yoga Sutra, it has none. Hatha Yoga Pradipika, on the other hand, has 22. This is the original from Goraknath. So basically, we are talking about a handful of different postures. I'm going to define a timeline for modern yoga, starting with 1890. It's somewhat arbitrary, but you will see in a second that this is where we can trace the modern postural yoga too. Before that period, of course, between the time of Goraknath and 1890, whole bunch of yogis did exist, but they had monastic existence. Typically, they lived in conclaves which were financed by the corresponding landowners or kings. Or they had wandering monks who were looking for financing for various purposes across the country or across the region. So they were, in a sense, somewhat esoteric. What brought in that to mainstream was done single-handedly by Swami Vivekananda. He played a vital role in all of this. And in the process, he made several trips across India and across the world, first for his own enlightenment and then for building organizations. In 1891, Swami Sachidananda started his journey from Calcutta all the way through Bhagalpur to Sarnath to Ayodhya to Agra to Hardwar, and ended up in Khetri, which had a king named Ajit Singh. Sachidananda was renamed Vivekananda by the king himself, and that's how we know him today as Swami Vivekananda. That was at the insistence of Ajit Singh. Swami Vivekananda then went on to travel not just around the northern parts of India, but from there he went further west all the way through various other notable places like Mount Abu, Ahmedabad, Baroda, and various parts of Gujarat, where he learned a whole bunch of different customs, including he visited the temple of Somnath, and then he went down further south to Bombay, to Pune, to Goa, and to Bangalore, Mysore, all the way down to the tip of India called Kanyakumari, before he went out to further east to Pondicherry, Madras, Hyderabad, and then went back to Calcutta. So that was his first trip for over a period of 3 years. And that's what was his process of self-discovery. As I mentioned, Ajit Singh, who gave the name Swami Vivekananda, he was grateful for him to bless him so that he could have a son. And he made it possible and facilitated his journey to the World Parliament of Religions, which was convened as part of the multifaceted World's Columbia Exposition in Chicago. And at that meet, there were two people who made history. One was Swami Vivekananda, the other was Eugene Sandow, who was known as a strong man. And Sandow took great interest in India, in part because he was hosted by an Indian while his stay in London. People typically think of the World Exposition where Swami Vivekananda spoke for the first time in his entire life. He had never given a public speech. That was not just something about religion only. It had a whole host of other things. For example, as I mentioned, Eugene Sandow showed his prowess for his physical ability. And not only that, it had other burlesque shows. For example, Little Egypt, who did the snake dance in that show, in that exposition, in the due course. So it was a potpourri of lots of different things, not just something strictly religious. After his success in Chicago, Swami Vivekananda was in great demand in the US. All across, he gave lots of different speeches and to many different gatherings. Main purpose of his trip was to finance an institution which he was going to build in order to propagate his start of a new form of Neo-Vedanta movement. So he started one right in New York City, where he gave a bunch of demonstrations in various forms, and part of it was in terms of physical exercise that is generally not emphasized, but it was there. Then he passed his mantle of the Vedanta Society in New York to Swami Avedananda, and Swami Avedananda started this whole thing realizing that if he were to survive in this process, he has to provide physical forms, and he started teaching Hatha Yoga, prescribing them purely for health benefits. After over 3 years abroad, Swami Vivekananda returned to India. He stopped in Colombo first, and he was there received by a thundering crowd where he gave several lectures. And that was the start of his lecture tour, that he went from all the way from Colombo to Almora in northern India, giving lectures in various spots along the way. That became known as his India lectures, in which he expounded on lots of different things, not just about Vedanta or other nitty-gritty of his various exposition of the Indian sacred texts, but he also talked about what needs to be done. When Swami Vivekananda started his trip all the way from Colombo to Almora, he gave a series of speeches. And in some of it, he explained what he meant by what he wants to do with the education system. And he advocated practical education. For example, in one of his speeches, he said, education is not the amount of information that is put into your brain and run riot there, undigested all your life. We must have life-building, man-making, character-making assimilation of ideas. If you have assimilated 5 ideas and made them your life and character, you have more education than any man who has got by heart the whole library. In the same series of lectures, he also advocated physical education, and he was very, very strong on physical education. Partly it was a reaction to how the British and Europeans in general saw India. For example, Lord Curzon's secretary, Sir Frank Dunlop Smith, said, a low-lying people in a low-lying land, referring to Bengal, with the intellect of a Greek and the grit of a rabbit. That's how they denigrated the locals. So Vivekananda, along with others, had clear in their mind that they want to promote physical education. And at one point he said, heaven is nearer through football than through Gita. We want men of strong biceps. And this is clearly a warrior monk speaking through the discipline of force, namely Hatha Yoga. Swami Vivekananda had one strong, I mean literally strong, European to support him, and that was Eugene Sandow. Sandow visited India for 8 months during 1904-1905. He was to visit during the lifetime of Swami Vivekananda, but unfortunately he died a couple of years earlier. But Eugene Sandow gave a series of lectures and where he demonstrated how strong you can be. And he said of the people and to these people that native Indians have a fine foundation for the building of large physical men. And he argued that the reason why the Indians were not strong is because they lacked proper food and exercise, which made them thin and haggard. And he devised a correspondence course where he actually proposed how this thing can be done. So this is where the seeds of modern yoga were planted. It came out with Swami Vivekananda's book called Raja Yoga. Even though it was called Raja Yoga, it had scientific basis on what he thought as how things can be demonstrated through experiential or experimental and not through metaphysical means. And this really gave rise to the Hatha Yoga as we know today. And this was reinforced by the trip that Eugene Sandow had.